perhaps Graham, perhaps we'll start. It's 25 to. Maybe I can begin just with saying thank you very much for Graham for giving this talk and acknowledging country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, particularly I think this week of the Wadawurrung people. We're involved in the Geelong strategic assessment at the moment, and there are 700 hectares of Golden Sun Moth habitat there, and 600 of those are likely to be lost. So I'm appalled at our ability to continue to damage the country that the Wadawurrung and other peoples, First Nation peoples, have looked after so well for so long. So I don't know what else to say apart from that, really. That's and we hope that things get better in the future. Graham Jury, he's from TREC Land Services. He was employed by Trust for Nature last year to bring together a whole lot of literature about Golden Sun Moth, the good, the bad, the ugly, the personal comms, the grey literature, and so on. So he's got a very good, broad understanding of the issues. He's been particularly focused on grassland conservation. Graham, please correct me when I go wrong here, for about 10 years or so, in grasslands in particular. And he has a good knowledge of a whole lot of other creatures and worlds as well. But I will let Graham expand on that, and thank him very much for his giving this talk. But I should say, please mute yourself unless you are asking the question, and please leap in and interrupt Graham at the earliest opportunity you feel like. We'd like a more conversational, I think, approach to this, rather than just a lecture with questions after, if you feel up for that. I think that's about it. Obviously, we're being recorded, so if that bothers you, perhaps just turn your microphone and video off. Generally, you can put questions in the chat as well if you don't feel like speaking up, and I will take the pleasure of interrupting Graham on your behalf. All right, that sounds about it. Graham, over to you. Thank you.
All righty. How are we doing, folks?
Very well.
All right. My name's Graham. Topic today is Victoria's Golden Sun Moths, challenges and complexities of managing a cryptic invertebrate. I'll just apologize in advance because I'm an absolute shocker for going off on mad tangents, and I am more used to speaking to a room in person than over Zoom, so bear with me. We'll see how we go. Yeah, just yell out if you want to interject with something. I'd probably prefer to just talk as we go. All right. I also acknowledge the traditional stewardship and sovereignty of the traditional owners of these lands that we've been fortunate enough to walk upon. And in the context of what I'm talking about today, that's predominantly Wadawurrung and Wurundjeri. I'd also like to acknowledge all the past survey work that has been done on Golden Sun Moths, predominantly by ARI, by NCNC, Merri Creek Management Committee, and by Biosis, largely and importantly through the late, great Daniel Gilmore. This body of work was absolutely essential for understanding what we know today about Golden Sun Moths. Here's a long list of people that talked to me and participated in this project as well, helping us get our heads around some of the various specifics about this topic. I won't call you out in person, but it was great, and thanks a lot. Okay, here are golden sun moths. Here's a male on the right and a female on the left. I think one of the first things people often ask me is why are golden sun moths special or important? And that's a fairly subjective question. I'd say, really, if you ask me, there's a few key things that do make them jump out. We've tended to focus on them because they're an insect that is linked to grasslands in southeastern Australia. And I guess invertebrate ecology in general is at a state where it's difficult to point to specific species in such a small and fragmented landscape. This one has tended to jump out for a few reasons. So if you look at them carefully, they've got green goggly eyes and long club-like antennae, and they look a little bit more like butterflies than moths. They're a basal moth, so they are kind of intermediate in form for that sort of reason. The male and the female are different in their anatomy. We'd call that sexual dimorphism. So the male has much longer wings in proportion to his body than the female. She's basically a big bloated sack of eggs who can fly a little bit. The maximum she'd get to would be a couple of 100 meters, 400 under winds, but that would be pretty rare. Even the male isn't great at flying. He tends to zip along the top of tussocks. They do not have mouths, so they only live for usually 1 day, but under the right conditions, they can stretch that out till 4. So they will live under soil as a larva for years, and then under peak perfect conditions in the summer, they will ping out and spend a day reproducing. And if any of you have ever done any work with golden sun moth, you'll be aware that will be typically under about 30 degrees Celsius over the Christmas New Year period on cloudless, fairly windless days. So it is pretty brutal out there. Yeah. I'll just quickly go over what we were doing in this project. So this was Trust for Nature's brief. There is increasing evidence that conservation style management, including weed control, burning, and revegetation, may not achieve high population sizes of GSM when compared to standard management practices, farm grazing, and frequent mowing. A number of significant and large populations co-occur within patches of high-threat environmental weeds like Chilean needlegrass. So this is a strange set of circumstances to have with a threatened species to begin with. We wanted to explore and look at this and see where this leads us and what it indicates in the future. Where do we go from here? What spurred this off? In 2020, the conservation status of Victoria's GSM population was revised from critically endangered down to vulnerable due to the high numbers of newly discovered populations as part of the conservation status assessment project. So I wrote this. It's coming out pretty soon. If you'd like an advance copy, flick me an email. It's 90 pages long and it's about big enough to stun a rhino. So we'll just go over some of the main points today, I think. Current state of play report for the golden sun moth. We aim to synthesize existing knowledge about the species habitat and management needs, make interim management recommendations based on current knowledge, identify critical knowledge gaps which require additional research to assist with the GSM's long-term survival, and assist with understanding land manager perspectives on the GSM, in particular, how to balance GSM conservation with other conservation priorities in grassy ecosystems. And this last one is pretty key and will be something I keep coming back to. Okay, The genus Cinnamon, the sun moths, there are about 44 of them. They mostly, in an Australian context, as there are a few in other countries, evolved in central South Australia in quite dry and arid environments. And golden sun moth originally occurred here too. This is so long ago and drawing from so few papers when there was so little known about this animal and its distribution that a lot needs to be done. It is tenuous and we can't really set any hard dates to any of this at this point in time. But that's where they came from, entering the Wimmera into Victoria in geological time. Golden sun moth has since gone extinct in South Australia. So our population here is particularly ancient and important. And any populations occurring within the Wimmera are probably going to hold very special genetics, their own unique local haplotypes. And if you have been up that way and looked for sun moths where it's even hotter and drier and more brutal, and you do know what to look for, you would potentially see some subtle differences in those populations there. And folks in the know would even suggest there's whole new subspecies of sun moth in some of these grasslands. So there is a lot going on. Next, they started to move across the Victorian volcanic plains through a suite of completely different landscapes, which tended to be Thermidid dominated. And there is a whole lot to unpack there and what that means, because when you're moving out of the Wimmera south into more fertile landscapes, you need to start thinking about how these landscapes can emulate the same features, which we will get onto. Then they hit the highlands and they couldn't cross the mountains, so they started moving north and established populations in Australian Capital Territory and New South Wales. And these are perhaps the most famous populations that most of the literature has surrounded. Many of these were based in Canberra, and a lot of what we know about sun moths comes from up here. And it also means that a lot of the GSM populations in North Victoria will tend to reflect this new clade of genetics. So they will be more associated perhaps with the outer state GSM than the ones in the Wimmera that are the really ancient ones. There is a lot to do in this space, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, golden sun moth biology. As I mentioned, the female can barely fly. So that establishes some pretty hard thresholds on what can actually happen with GSM in a fragmented landscape. If your grassland has been cut off by a multi-lane highway, and then there is an urban development, and then there's a little bit more development, very rapidly you've got a very small grassland surrounded by an urban matrix. And if you're a little bug that can only move 400 meters at a time, you're going to be isolated within that remnant. So within basically a day, possibly 4, they will turn into an adult in peak conditions in the summer, and that's when they will do most of their activity. But most of what's known about sun moths is the adult moth, but that doesn't really reflect what it's about, because while it only lives for a few days as an adult, it lives for several years underground. And we know next to nothing about golden sun moth larvae, even at this point. There are documented cases where an egg has turned into a moth within a year, and then sometimes it takes 3 years, and then there are suggestions it might be 4 or 5 based on related species. The first stage of the larva is about 1 centimeter long, and it can live for up to a year. And this larva tends to live in the bases of grass tussocks, so it doesn't even live under the soil. And this opens up a whole can of worms when you're doing land management, is it means that at any time you are deploying a burn or chemicals or even intensive sheep grazing, you can never guarantee that sun moths are entirely inactive and entirely under the soil. So go figure with that. One perhaps even more concerning, alarming, or interesting factor about larvae that was totally news to me before this project is that they are temporarily sequestered in the soil. So if you go out to a GSM site and you go and do a survey under perfect conditions and there's no moths, you might tend to assume that your population has dropped out and gone extinct. But what perhaps is actually happening is you have got a temporarily sequestered group of populations. You might have 2 or 3 in the same area at once that just look like it's one population. And each group of grubs only come out of the soil every 2 or 3 years, and they have almost no way of interacting with the other moths on the site. And perhaps 1 or 2 of them might go extinct, so your moths might only be active every 3rd year. We need to know a lot more about this. And until we do, it opens up a whole can of worms, I think, in terms of assessing population status and health. The pupae of a sun moth might be able to live for several years in total stasis as well. It can diapause, and this has not been studied yet, but it does sometimes come up in related cinnamon moths.
Sorry, Graham, what's
Okay.
diapause?
Oh, I'm sorry. Say again.
What's diapause, Graham?
Oh, diapause, right. So kind of entering a point of stasis where it's not actually growing or changing, it's just waiting. And because sun moths need perfect temperature and biomass conditions in order to activate, if they don't get them, they either die or they find a way to wait it out. And yeah, so I would argue we need a bit more attention in the ability for sun moths to wait out of suboptimal seasons. A bit more on that later. Where do you find sun moths and what do they need? Historically, we would have said that you could reduce a sun moth habitat down to a few key plants and a few key density factors, and that was about that. But recent research has called a lot of that into question. And as we know that sun moths are perhaps not quite as limited as we thought, if they're a bit more flexible and a little bit more able to adjust season to season when they get weird, muggy weather and too much rain, and the biomass is out of whack, we then have to start thinking about landscape connectivity and what's with that. So Alex Cook and Tim Wells' research has suggested heavily that the best environment for sun moths, at least within the VVP context, would have different sorts of landscape features. It's going to have some slopes, it's going to have some stony rises, it's going to have some dry areas and some wet areas. And the sun moths within the site are going to move around based on what the weather and the soil and the biomass is doing, rather than just doing the same thing right across the site. So I would say the very best way to think about and conserve sun moths is to have very large sites with quite a lot of heterogeneity going on to allow the moths to move around the site, and different areas will probably hatch at different times. and that's going to make it very difficult to survey, but that is life. Wallaby grasses and spear grasses are the predominant things they feed on, although there is probably a suite of other grasses as well, and that's been a really difficult thing to study because we have such difficulty in raising sun moth larvae outside of the soil of a grassland. It's only really been touched upon, and that work has predominantly been happening up in Canberra. Yes, they eat Chilean needlegrass as well, which we'll get on to soon. The main no-no for sun moths is phosphorus in the soil. So superphosphate treatments last century tended to knock them out more than anything. Other than that, they're not that fussy. You'll see sun moths living in clays, in sands, and in loams. Yeah, not a big one, that one. So there is a grassland in Canberra called York Park where sun moths have persisted in a documented state for several decades, and it is only 400 meters square. So if you're really on top of how to manage your grassland botany, you've got the right composition of grasses and you keep them at the right height, you don't need very much space for this species. But that's not ideal. Really, you want a big interconnected landscape. You want dynamism. You want all sorts of factors in play, interacting in the most natural way you can. That way, when anything changes, you've got the highest chance possible that your moths are going to continue to persist. So quickly looking here, we've got wallaby grass on the left and spear grass on the right. These are the two genera of grasses that are the most typical food plants for sun moths. I won't really break down species to species because that's getting a bit too finicky here. But basically, Rhytidosperma is quite a short-lived grass. It's very disturbance tolerant, and it tends to be one of the groups of native plants that will recolonize a disturbed landscape the fastest. Stipers tend to be a bit hardier and live a lot longer. They do a lot of their growth during the colder months of the year. That's part of their carbon cycle. People in the know would suggest that the fancier wallaby grasses you have, the more likely you are to have sun moths persisting in an area. And a lot of the most sensitive Rhytidospermas tend to, as a result, have more moths on a site if they are retained. So this is pretty key. If you look on the left, you've got a characteristic looking Victorian volcanic plains landscape. It's bright orange because it's full of Ephemeter, but it's also pretty high biomass and it's pretty dense. And VVP ecology requires fairly constant disturbance and upheaval, or it tends to lock into this dominant state where you've got one thing, this sea of Ephemeter. There's not a lot of spaces between these tussocks and there's not a lot going on. So you need to burn it in order to reduce its biomass, or you need grazing from something in order to get it back to that state. In deep time, these processes would have been wildfire events and First Nation peoples performing agricultural practices. And you also had a massive community of different kinds of grazing animals, most of which are extinct. You had herds of things like diprotodons, so it was a really different world. We really only have roos doing this sort of work now. But golden sun moth, which we would associate with VVP landscapes, doesn't actually eat Thermida as far as we know. It eats stipes and wallaby grasses. So looking on the right, we've got a completely different looking landscape filled with GSM food plants. So these C3 grasses tend to be around the edges of Thermida grasslands. They need a little bit different conditions. They'll grow where it's really dry or where it's rocky. And you need a fairly serious concerted disturbance event before you break that Thermida dominance and you get a different composition of species emerging at scale like this. Now, what is very, very interesting is that within Victoria, you won't see a landscape like this for the most part, unless it's a sheep farm or it has had heavy sheep farming in the past. Thermida tends to be one of the first species that goes from this kind of heavy impact, and then your native grasses will shift around if you're lucky and you don't have a massive weed fest, and the grassland itself will transition into this strange successional state where some of these more liminal edge species start to dominate. When I say liminal species, this is a term we've started playing around with. It basically means a species that needs really heavy disturbance. It needs things to smack out the dominant structure of the system in order to be a common thing itself. They look for edges, they look for opportunities, and they proliferate. And then later there'll be something a bit more dominant and long-lived that will push them back out again. And I would argue that sun moths are related to this system predominantly. They're an opportunistic disturbance requiring animal, which opens up a few questions about where they fit into a VVP landscape. So let's quickly look at GSM in Victoria. We're looking down the bottom at a map of where the GSM are according to current data. I talked about this a bit briefly before. One thing that's really important to think about with GSM in Victoria is every one of these dots is a result of past survey effort, and past survey effort isn't independent of other factors. It's determined by where developer pressure has been for the most part. Now we've got these wonderful citizen science platforms popping up where hopefully we can move beyond that and people can just get excited about insects and log their own data free from that. But it's meant that historically we've tended to see most survey attention within Melbourne and within the Western Plains. That's given a disproportionate picture of where sun moths actually are. Sun moths used to be prolifically common. They would have been right across Victoria's grassland systems, but as agriculture started to expand, they appeared to be dropping out. They were gone. One after another, populations we knew about were gone. And by 1991, there was only a single documented population left that anyone could, with any reliability, say was still extant. And that spurred a whole renewed interest in this genus. A lot of the core work was coming out of Canberra at that time, but it did flow down here and more populations were discovered. And when Merri Creek Management Committee and Arthur Rylah Institute really started engaging with this, more and more populations came up. And we currently have well over 100 documented populations that we know are still extant. But because sun moth is such a difficult, finicky animal to look for, you've got to go out of the Christmas, New Year period under the sun, and you've got to pick your weather perfectly or you will not see them. They've slipped through the cracks in many, many areas. So it is likely that there are vast numbers of sun moth populations right across Victoria that we don't know about, that aren't documented yet. So what we do know about sun moths tends to be derived from urban populations, because they were some of the first ones that were rediscovered. So small, struggling grasslands within Canberra, and similar situations happening within Melbourne, along the Merri Creek, Cooper Street grassland, Craigieburn grassland. But as we found more and more sun moth populations, we found that they are increasingly occurring within rural landscapes, occupying much larger habitats. So some of what we know and some of what we assume does not really stack up, and we can't apply things from a city to an agricultural landscape with total confidence. Okay, Chilean needlegrass. This, I would say, is a lovely problem to have. This is an invasive grass from South America that, for whatever reason, is very, very close in terms of its physiology to Ostrastipa, which, as I mentioned, is one of the core food plants for GSM. So Chilean needlegrass is a noxious weed, but it is perfect as a food plant for this species. It rapidly adopted it and started to proliferate within landscapes that were infected by Chilean, to the point that some of the biggest populations of golden sun moth known now are in areas that are completely dominated by Chilean, and even some of the food plants that we would normally expect are next to extinct in some of these sites. So if you absolutely hammer your lawn of Chilean and you have GSM peripheral to the area, you are probably going to have a massive boom in this species. That's got all kinds of complications and problems for other grassland ecology. And it opens up another can of worms. You've got a very important sun moth population that's learned to eat Chilean, then you are in the conundrum of, do you control the Chilean and try to replace it with other grasses, knowing that that's going to impact your moths? Or do you let the site degrade into a big Chilean fest and leave it at that and just have it as a moth reserve? We didn't have the choice. We had to just keep the moths back in the day. But as we found more and more populations, hopefully we can start questioning that and focus this more on where are the important populations holding the best priority genetics. Because if we haven't got a very good reason to protect a population and it conflicts with other biodiversity values, possibly we should just remove the Chilean. Another issue that we have with Chilean is that it's too good as a food plant for GSM. So GSM that live in a Chilean landscape will usually go from egg to moth within a single year. They reach much larger sizes as a grub much faster, and you'll have sometimes several grubs eating the same tussocks roots, which you would never see within native grasses. So it is just a super food for this species. And that's all well and good, but under climate change, these landscapes are not static. They're moving, they're pulsing, they're ebbing. And if Chilean suddenly starts dropping out and things get drier and all the moths are evolved to eat this perfect opulent food source and it's gone, they are perhaps going to struggle when things dry out a bit. Okay, quickly looking at what are the biggest threats to sun moths. Landscape level change is really the big one. So a lot of Victoria's grasslands, as you'll well know, got absolutely hammered last century. So we lost about 95% of intact habitats, and that's even higher within Melbourne City. As I say, though, it's a shift from original grassland state to, in many cases, agricultural landscapes. And just because it's an agricultural landscape doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't retain some factors that will benefit some sorts of species. At the top, we've got a big, dirty, broadacre cropping field, and there is no hope of anything persisting there. And down the bottom, we have a big pit of Phalaris aquatica grass, and you can see that all the grassland structure is gone. There isn't a hell of a lot of hope for native species persisting here either. One of the worst and most serious things that generally did lead to population extinctions for golden sun moth was superphosphate application. That rapidly led to local extinctions of most of its food plants, and it probably is directly poisonous to the moths as well. But what it also does is it provides huge amounts of nutrients to pump a whole lot of weedy grasses, which will proliferate and turn a grassland away from a original native state into a dense thicket without any intertussock spacing. And if you lose your intertussock spacing, the female moth is no longer going to be able to display to the male. She needs these intertussock spaces to sit in and flash her golden wings so that the male will be able to come and find her. Disturbance is, of course, a key part of a grassland landscape. And while we need that coming from somewhere, be it fire or grazing, there's a point where if you absolutely hammer grassland with too intensive disturbance, some of the grass species that the moths need will start to be impacted. So the hooves of stock animals, cattle and horses, too much human traffic or vehicle traffic, eventually you'll start compacting the soil, and that's going to be bad for the grubs, and it's going to deplete the abundance of the food plants as well. So this is another thing to think about. Okay, climate change is obviously really, really complicated and complex, and none of us really understand how it's going to intersect with grasslands with a lot of confidence. But one thing I would say on that is that Themata and the native food plants are in quite a fine state of flux and balance based on weather patterns. So the abundance of C3 grasses and the dominance of Themata is dictated by the weather as much as it is anything else. And slight changes to the weather can lead to Themata becoming more prolific and pushing out some of these species. It can also favor certain kinds of weeds moving into landscapes. And then there are areas like up in the Wimmera or around the Yuyangs and the rain, in its rain shadow grasslands, where changes to the climate are going to make a dry landscape even drier, and then there can be a rapid species shift, and some of the food plants that sun moths need could plausibly go extinct. And again, if you are in an urban landscape and it's a small grassland, you're going to have all different kinds of edge effects, which are going to be exacerbated. That's why large interconnected sites with a lot of spatial heterogeneity are going to be more robust, and they're going to have more going on than a small fragmented urban zone. because slight changes can lead to species extinction under that context more easily. And on that, we'll quickly go over some studies on some of these urban systems. Brian Bainbridge and Michael Longmore from Merri Creek Management Committee noticed a few alarming effects within Melbourne and some of the sites they were interested in. We'd call these alley effects. An alley effect is an impact on a species that is really only evident when populations drop to a critical size. So when you've got natural conditions and you've got a big interconnected population, it's robust, it can cope with some change. But when your population drops, minor factors start becoming more and more important, and they can be quite critical, especially, sun moth cannot potentially disperse beyond 400 meters. It needs its grassland habitat with intertussock spaces in order to hop from site to site. So it can be rapidly isolated. So a small urban grassland has got a very high perimeter to surface area ratio. So it's got edges all around it. And where there is an edge, there is going to be problems coming in. So willy wagtail at the top is one of the key predators for sun moths. And if willy wagtails have somewhere to perch, then they will congregate en masse along with a whole host of other avian predators. And when it comes to that perfect few days of the year where sun moths come out, predatory animals in a grassland have a good sense of that too, and they're going to chow down on your threatened moths. And that can lead effectively to populations dropping out. If you've only got 20 or 30 moths active at a time, you might lose every single one of them to birds in an urban landscape. There is a pile of golden yellow glass in the other corner. And if you are a near mindless insect that zips around in a grassland looking for flashing golden colors, because that's what your females look like, that's going to be quite tempting. And Bainbridge and Longmore noticed that in some of their grasslands, this was a factor, and accumulating rubbish on the edges was actually pulling the male moths to the site edges where they'd attempt to mate with golden glass. And again, they're wasting their precious time. They're probably only alive for one day, and the closer they are to the edge, the more at risk of predation they are. So that is dangerous in a small population. You don't have a rich, complex, reliable, interconnected breeding day. You might only have a tiny number of individuals reproducing, and then you get inbreeding effects, and it continues to spiral. So genetic factors are really important as a consideration for sun moths. And on the broader scale, that's a thing we have concern about as well. There are some preliminary efforts to translocate moths from grassland to grassland and reintroduce them into areas they've dropped out of. But knowing what we do about their rapid ability to drop out of a system and their inability to move across intermediate landscapes, especially in urban areas, we start to risk the other side of things, which is outbreeding. Are the moths from two different areas too separated that if we attempt to reintroduce them into one population, is that going to cause problems in terms of fecundity? And this is a big question mark. There aren't clear answers for this. So in brief, we'll have a look at optimal ideal management of sun moth landscapes you need your C3 grasses, you need intertussock spaces. You need to have this in a stable manner. You need to continue to emulate and reflect what's happening in the landscape as best as you can in deep time. Because one of the things that's most important about sun moth conservation and retaining sun moth sites is that places they already are able to support them. So this is one of the big dangers. We can attempt to bring all this science into a site and we can say this is the optimal way to manage, but the reality is if the sun moths are already there, they probably like the conditions they've got. And if we are to look at sheep farms as sun moth habitat, which we really should do as there are lots, we need to allow farmers and land managers to continue these processes they've been using for decades, which have retained the sun moths on their landscapes. And so as consultants and scientists, where we come to look at these moth populations, I cannot stress enough that we need to incorporate the views and perspectives of land managers into how these landscapes are managed, and that requires equal two-way conversation. That needs flexible management. So biomass management needs to be able to happen in a reflexive manner in these sites. One thing that's important as well is maintaining that heterogeneity. It cannot just be a generic flat field of the same stuff because climate and weather doesn't work like that. You'll find stony rises and little hillocks, and the sun moths need these. If everything bogs up and it gets wet, these small rises are probably the last refuges in a site under suboptimal conditions where the moths will survive. So you get these little micro populations that must be retained and protected. This is where they'll move out from when things dry out again. Fire is hard to predict, and it is hard to say with confidence and accuracy what its full impacts are on sun moths, but I would tend to push the other direction, and I would say that there is a wealth and abundance of sites where sites have been burnt routinely, sites have been grazed routinely, and there are still prolific numbers of sun moths. And if anything, I am most concerned about the lack of grazing on sites, because most of the areas where we would say golden sun moth has gone extinct has tended to be because the biomass management system was rapidly upset. Sheep were taken off, grazing was lost, and it filled up with weeds, and then the moths didn't have anywhere to display and reproduce anymore. I won't go into too much detail here, but we looked at a number of sites across Victoria for different case studies to test some of what we were looking at and to learn from people that were managing these areas. Mount Piper was particularly interesting to look at. That was one of the first sun moth populations in Victoria to be rediscovered, and its issues are very different to a lot of other areas. You can see some acacia pycnantha starting to creep in. So it's a derived woodland. You're trying to maintain a grassland in an area that perhaps doesn't want to be, and you've got a whole slew of other issues related to that. Do you want your grassland species to supersede the values of what's in your woodland? Perhaps and perhaps not. It's difficult. Chepstow of Land of Sweeping Plains fame is an amazing case study for what can be done with low intensity sheep farming. Very, very high numbers of moths with very little direct attention to maintain them. That's probably to do with the hilly state of that site, amongst some other factors. And just in brief, some of the big pervading issues that we want to resolve moving forwards are to be able to more reliably look for sun moths when the weather goes to puss and we've got a wet, muggy season. We're going out there, we're not seeing very many moths. It's cloudy, we don't have the right conditions, but perhaps we need to assess this population because we've only got 1 year to look for them. So we need to change some of our approaches, and there are options to do this. Some of the things we're most interested in are bringing back some techniques that were championed about 10 years ago, but already are falling out of favor and are definitely not used in Victoria. So if we find the moth casings and we are able to build up a series of keys and expertise to be able to tell these casings clearly from other insect casings, we've got a reliable way to count how many moths have emerged per area, more than wandering around looking for emerging moths. So that's a big one. That should be a really cool honors project for somebody, and hopefully they can put a bit more attention into larvae and the timing of emergence and change. So that'll be good. eDNA is sampling the soil for specific DNA so that you can assess something's presence, whether or not you see it. And that's happening too. EnviroDNA are spearheading that. And we're interested in as many sites as we can get to sample more moths so we can build a genetic assay. And that will be wonderful when that is done because it will give us another tool to use to assess whether sun moths are present in an area independent of what the weather's doing in a particular year. I'd also add that sun moth conservation should not just be about golden sun moths. We have several other species within Victoria that are all much, much more rare and much more poorly known than golden sun moth. And these species tend to not get a lot of attention and focus. And that's a very sad thing indeed, because they're pretty cool. There is a reserve specifically for pale sun moth in the hill up in the Wimmera, and even that one is producing possibly not very favorable results recently. The moths haven't been seen there for a couple of years as far as I can find out. So I would encourage, if you're interested in grassland conservation and you want to incorporate insects and you've got money to survey for sun moths, try to expand out a bit and try to pay attention to other stuff that's around. Look for opportunities to protect a whole suite of different species and avoid getting too bogged down, focused on single ones. And hopefully that's what a flagship for conservation should be doing. Thanks a lot. I think that's me. I just want to reiterate, you can flip me an email if you are interested in hearing any more about any of this. I can flick you the full report, and we'd love more opportunities to go and look for moths in different areas. Thanks a lot. Any questions?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Graham. That was fantastic. Alan Ford's just got a comment in the chat that York Park has been well, lost. That's always a bad word, isn't it? It's not like we misplaced it. It's been gone. It's gone. So that's a shame. You would have thought it might have.
That seemed to be one of the more secure ones up there. That is very bad news.
You'd think if it was like such an old site, it would have had special protection, but
well, some of them did. They were able to get some of the grasslands in Canberra protected as heritage areas just based on science surveys for sun moths of all things.
Yes. Okay. So, those other species you mentioned. Sorry to go off immediately talking about another species, but Debbie, no, Debbie's got her hand up. Deb, talk to us.
Sorry, I missed the start of it a bit. You might have already said it, but do they don't always hatch every year or something? Like isn't there a few years sometimes where they just don't hatch at all, but they could still be there? Is that right or true?
That's right. So usually they will hatch every year, but they might hatch very, very low numbers if it's wet and muggy.
Year. Okay.
So usually if you really are careful to pick your day, you will see sun moths, even in a bad year. But if it's your job to assess the whole population, then that year is just not a good one to be doing that. But then it gets more complicated because if you look at what the larvae are capable of doing, maybe they take 3 years to reach adulthood because the grasses they eat on that site are not particularly
not
nutritious
enough.
So they go slowly, and maybe they don't come out every year. Maybe you go out under perfect conditions, but your moths are just not coming out. They're not ready yet. And that makes it an absolute nightmare when you are trying to survey a grassland. And we would normally say you want to spend 4 years surveying the same site to have any confidence of assessing whether or not moths are present and what their numbers might look like. They don't make it easy on themselves.
Sure. There's quite a lot of flightless moths. I know when I was looking at the Pimelia, the caterpillars that are on Pimelia, when I hatched them, because I kept them, they actually were a lot of flightless moths. They were quite amazing, which I'd never seen before. It was bizarre. Also, there's an exhibition at Water Gardens. I don't know if you've seen it. It's stunning. And it's got Golden Sun Moth. They've got butterflies all over 2 huge walls that just looks amazing. And they're highlighting Golden Sun Moth down the end where the supermarket's been removed, that end. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's really good. So I'll let you know.
I like any insect conservation anywhere, so it always makes me happy when there's even a slight amount of interest in grassland insects. I'll go and check it out.
Yeah, good do.
Those other species you mentioned, Graham, you said they're critically endangered, they're federally listed under the EPBC?
Yes, they are. Most of them are single dots on Atlas of Living Australia, confined to single sites. They tend to be a bit more habitat specific than Golden Sun Moth. So some of them are Wimmera only, living in really arid conditions. That one at the top left, striated sun moth. As far as I know, there's only one site that supports that, and that's up north of Mount Piper somewhere, and they tend to live in a more riparian grassland state.
Okay, so of no use to urban Melbourne grassland conservation.
No, if they were ever down here, they're long gone. There are some other sun moths in the Brisbane ranges, at least, but they are very poorly known. But they do sometimes ping up on citizen science sites.
Right. Any other questions, people? Must be millions. Diprotodon grazing. Do we know anything about the extent of that?
I would assume it was quite prolific, but then I am biased because I really like Tim Flannery, and he tells really cool stories in his work about big megafaunal herds moving around the landscape. This is so long ago that it is difficult to even relate it into what I think modern grassland ecology looks like. But the point is, there are so many large grazing animals that are gone that we've tended to forget, I think, some of these processes that would have originally been there creating disturbance. And I think when we look at agriculture and sheep farming, it is important to try to contextualize some of what happens today in this deep time scenario. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed. It's very interesting. I'll have to go read some of that Tim Flammery stuff. I haven't done that. Do you think the Golden Sun Moth will be delisted at some point? We're doing such a good job of finding populations of them.
I think that will be entirely dependent upon how prolific and detailed survey focus is. If it was going to happen, it would happen in a purely Victorian context because sun moth in New South Wales and ACT are struggling and are a lot rarer. And I don't see that changing anytime. You've only got so much to work with within Canberra and its surrounds. You don't have the same options to enact conservation measures across a massive landscape, which I think we do here. 22% of the agricultural estate in Victoria could be described as native pasture that would support Rhytidosperma and Ostrastiper. So with the right conversations and the right attitude, I would say Golden Sun Moth has quite a lot of space to work with, and it is quite tolerant to production outcomes up to a point. And I, for one, am fairly optimistic about what could happen in that space.
Other questions, people? Otherwise, I'll just keep firing random things at Graham. Okay, one more. The eDNA testing, and then maybe we'll wind up. Is that must be? I understand it for aquatic systems, but everything would get quite mixed up in the water, and so easily identify the presence of a platypus or something. Golden sun moth, how it would seem a bit more scattergun. You've got to pick up the right bit of soil, or
yeah, it's new turf. There's very, very little precedent for using eDNA with soil. In fact, if any of you know of any good examples, I'd love to know because we feel we're stabbing a bit here. Basically, because we know that golden sun moths tend to congregate around stony rises within a site, we can have a reasonable degree of confidence about which soil in a landscape is most likely to have the sun moths in. Then you sink Hamiltons into the dirt and you take soil cores out, and that's what you're working with. But it is fairly new as an approach compared to sampling water. So yes, there are some questions attached to that. So far, it's looking promising from what I've heard. We've only got a couple of sites permitted to use, and an assay is being developed. But the more sites we can get, better. And hopefully later we can incorporate some of these other species of cinnamon as cross-reference DNA, which I think will be an important part of the picture as well.
the grassland eeless dragon would be, everyone's looking to see if they can use eDNA on that too, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, this was a fairly hopeful year for that, and that opens up another whole suite of possibilities. So I don't know. I don't work for EnviroDNA, and that will depend, I think, on what comes out of the next lot of surveys that happen over the next couple of years. But it would be nice to think so, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. All right. Well, perhaps we'll wind, unless anyone's got more questions. Let's wind up there. Thank you so much, Graham. It's really been very thought-provoking, and I know it will have a lot of direct impact on the submissions the Grassy Plains Network make in the future about management of various areas, like around the Geelong Strategic Assessment and so on. So we're looking to input into conservation approaches there. So yeah, very informative and very useful, and just very interesting. Yes. So thank you very much.